The letter arrived on a Tuesday, which was strange because nothing good had ever arrived on a Tuesday. Clara Whitfield was sitting at the plastic table in the Millbrook Family Shelter common room when the caseworker found her. Coffee going cold, a government form half filled out, Nora doing homework across from her with the kind of focused quiet that 9-year-olds produce when they know they shouldn't ask questions. "This came for you," the woman said. She set the envelope down like it was something that might bite. Clara looked at it. White envelope, thick paper. A law firm's return address from somewhere called Grantham and Associates, Telluride, Colorado. Her first thought was debt. Her second thought was also debt. Because when you've been sleeping in a shelter for 6 weeks with your daughter, the world sends you exactly two kinds of mail. Bills, and more bills. "Looks official," the caseworker said. And she stood there because she was trying to be kind, and kindness sometimes looks like a person hovering. Nora looked up from her homework, said nothing, went back to her math. Clara tore the envelope. Carefully, the way you open things when you've stopped trusting what's inside them. The paper was good quality, the letterhead crisp. The words at the top took her 3 passes to understand. "You are the sole heir and beneficiary of a property located in Coldwater Ridge, Colorado, by order of the estate of Arthur James Whitfield, deceased." Arthur Whitfield, her grandfather. The man nobody talked about. Clara read the letter again, then a third time, and then she put it flat on the table and pressed both palms against it like the words might escape if she let go. Property, a mountain cabin, sealed by county order since 1952. No one had entered it in over 70 years. She was named the sole beneficiary. Not her father, who had passed 2 years ago. Not her uncles. Her. A 38-year-old woman with $41 to her name and no car, and a daughter who had stopped complaining about the shelter food 6 days in because complaining she had quietly decided was not worth the energy. "Mom," Nora said. "1 minute," Clara said. Her voice came out fine. She didn't know how. She read the last paragraph again. The property had been held in trust, the lawyer explained. Updated as recently as 12 years ago, which meant her grandfather, a man she had last seen as a blur of a face in a faded photograph, had been thinking about her 12 years ago, had deliberately, specifically chosen her. The question that landed in her chest was not about the property, it was why. That night, lying on a narrow shelter mattress with Nora's breath going slow beside her, Clara stared at the ceiling and let herself do the arithmetic of her life. The divorce, the savings that turned into legal fees in about 3 months flat, the apartment she tried to hold by picking up double shifts at the restaurant and cleaning houses on weekends and telling Nora it was temporary. Temporary. That word she'd used 40 times until the landlord changed the locks and temporary became the car. And then the car became a repair she couldn't afford. And then the car became the shelter. 1 year, that's how fast it went. 12 months from a life she'd built by hand, piece by piece, to a plastic mattress and a number on a waiting list. But $41 in this letter. That was the inventory now. She thought about Arthur Whitfield. All she had was a photograph she'd found in a shoebox at her father's house years ago. Her grandfather, young, standing in front of pine trees, squared shoulders, a serious face. Her father had said only he was different, kept to himself. He left. Nobody talked about why. Nobody talked about why. That sentence, that was the whole of her grandfather's history in the family. She folded the letter back into the envelope, set it under the mattress, and she made the decision the way she'd made every decision in the last year. Not with confidence, not with a plan, with the simple, terrible logic of a person who has run out of directions to go except forward. In the morning, she asked the shelter caseworker about Telluride. "How do I get to Coldwater Ridge?" The woman typed something. "There's a bus to Grand Junction. From there, you'd have to connect." A pause. "It's mountain country up there. Deep woods. Hard winters." Clara nodded. "How much is the bus?" She borrowed the money from another woman at the shelter, Vera, who was saving for her own bus ticket east, and gave Clara what she had left over without making her feel like she was borrowing. That kind of generosity, the small kind, the kind people in difficult situations extend to each other without ceremony, because ceremony requires spare time, and spare time is a luxury. Clara packed their bags that afternoon. Nora helped folding things with the serious precision she'd developed recently. not commenting, not asking, until she did. "Are we moving again?" Nora asked quietly. Clara crouched down to her level, looked at her daughter's face, the dark eyes and the careful expression and the small crease of worry that had taken up permanent residence between her brows sometime around month 3. "Maybe for the last time," Clara said. Nora considered this. "You said that before." "I know. A beat. This time I have paperwork." Nora almost smiled. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the beginning of one which was enough. They left the next morning before the shelter breakfast line formed. The bus smelled of diesel and someone's fast food and the particular exhaustion of public transit at 7 a.m. Nora sat by the window. Clara sat beside her with the envelope in her bag and the $41 in her coat pocket and nothing else. The city fell away behind them. Buildings thinned. Subdivisions gave way to open road. And then the mountains came up out of the flat world like something that had been waiting for them, enormous and unhurried white at the peaks and dark with pine below, and Nora pressed her nose against the glass. "They're big," she said. "They are. Bigger than the buildings. Much bigger than the buildings." Nora thought about this for a while. Then she went back to watching them. And Clara watched them too. And the bus climbed into the mountains, and the air through the cracked window changed into something thin and sharp and cold. And the world outside the glass stopped looking like a world that had thrown them out. It started to look like somewhere else entirely. The bus dropped them at the end of the county road, 2 in the afternoon. The driver said nothing but handed Clara a small regional map that he'd clearly given out before folded to the page that showed Coldwater Ridge. She thanked him. He shrugged. The doors closed and the bus went back the way it came. And Clara and Nora stood in a gravel lot at the edge of a forest and looked at the mountains above them. No cell signal, which she'd been warned about. No other cars. A narrow path leading up into the trees, the kind of path that might be a trail or might be a ditch that learned to look like a trail. "Okay," Nora said. "Okay," Clara agreed. They started walking. The directions in the letter were handwritten. The lawyer had photocopied what looked like very old instructions, faded paper written in a script that looped and pressed hard. 3 miles past the old bridge, left at the cluster of rocks that looked like a doorstep. The gravel trail. Follow it until the tree line breaks. 1 mile in the paved road was already a memory. 2 miles in the forest had thickened around them into something cathedral quiet. Every footstep sounded like something. Every bird went suddenly quiet when they passed. The air was cold in a clean way, not the city cold that carried car exhaust and other people's cigarettes, but cold like altitude, like height, like the sky was closer here and the sky ran cold. Nora was quiet for a long time. "Then how long has the cabin been empty?" "Over 70 years, Clara said. "Why?" "I don't know yet." "What if it's haunted?" Clara looked at her. "Do you actually believe in ghosts?" Nora considered. "I believe in the atmosphere," she said, which was such a specific 9-year-old answer that Clara almost laughed. "There's no such thing as haunted houses," Clara said. "Only houses with long memories." Nora filed this away the way she filed everything. Silently. For future use. The bridge appeared first. Old wooden planks over a creek that wasn't so much flowing as moving slow and dark between snowmelt rocks. Clara tested it with 1 foot. It held. They crossed, and the cluster of stones was exactly where the letter said. Like someone had written the directions by heart. Like someone had walked this path so many times they could describe it in their sleep. The gravel trail beyond was almost invisible. A parting in the undergrowth more than a path. But it was there, and they followed it. Nora saw it first. "Mom!" She pointed. And Clara stopped walking and looked through the trees. The cabin sat in a clearing that the forest had grown around but not consumed. Like the trees had decided to leave it alone. Like they'd agreed collectively to keep their distance from this particular spot. It was small. A single-story log construction, the wood weathered to a silver gray that looked less like aging and more like patience. The windows were boarded with planks that had gone dark with decades of weather. The roof had patches that were newer than the rest. The chimney had a cap on it. A woodpile against one wall covered with canvas, so old the canvas had become part of the wood. Nothing was collapsed. Nothing was rotting. It was not the ruin Clara had prepared herself for. It looked paused, like someone had pressed a button in 1952 and the cabin had simply waited there doing its level best not to fall apart for someone to press it again. They stepped closer into the clearing and Clara saw the door. A metal plate bolted across the handle, rust-stained, official-looking, stamped with county markings that had faded to near illegibility, but she could still read the year. 1952. She reached into her bag and pulled out the legal folder. Inside was the notarized document the lawyer had sent. Her name, Arthur's name, authorized heir, authorized to remove the seal. Her hands were not quite steady. She noticed this, filed it, and held the papers anyway. Nora pressed close beside her, looking at the metal plate. "What does it say? Property closed by order of the county," Clara said. 1952. "That's before Grandpa was born." "Almost." Clara did the math. "Your great-grandfather sealed this door the year your grandfather was 5 years old." Nora stared at the metal plate. Why would someone put their kid out of a cabin? Clara didn't answer because she didn't have one. She walked around the outside of the cabin slowly instead. No broken windows behind the boards. No obvious structural damage she could see. No sign of recent visitors. The ground around the building was undisturbed old pine needles and frozen mud. No footprints but their own. Nobody had been here in a very long time. She came back to the door, pulled the small wrench from her bag borrowed from the shelter maintenance closet, slipped into her backpack with a note of apology left on the workbench she wasn't sure anyone would find. The bolts were old, rusted deep. The first one refused for a long time before she felt it give. "Can I help?" Nora asked. "Hold this." She handed her the folder. "Don't let it blow away." The second bolt was easier. The third was the worst, metal shrieking as it turned, the sound echoing out into the forest in a way that felt wrong, like a sound that had been held too long and was offended to be released. Clara stopped and listened. The forest gave back only its own sounds. Wind, birds resuming their conversations, the distant creak. She removed the plate. It was heavier than it looked. She set it carefully on the ground beside the door, face up, facing the sky it had been turned away from for over 7 decades. The door was old wood, dark with age. The handle was iron, the kind you grip with the whole hand. She looked at Nora. Nora looked back, document folder clutched to her chest, small face entirely serious in the way she had that always reminded Clara of something much older than 9. "Ready?" Clara asked. "Are you?" Nora said. That was the question, wasn't it? Clara turned back to the door. She wrapped her hand around the iron handle, and she thought for one brief moment about turning around, about walking back down the mountain and leaving this sealed place sealed, about returning to the shelter and the plastic table and the careful quiet of a life that asked nothing of her except to endure it. But there was nothing to return to. That was the only thing she knew for certain. What was behind her was already gone. She pushed the door. It moved slowly. A deep groan of wood and iron, not loud but final, the sound of a decision. Cold air came out first, a breath that was stale and still, and carrying the particular weight of decades-old paper, old wood, old ash, the ghost smell of things that had sat undisturbed long enough to become simply the smell of time. Clara stepped forward just far enough to look inside, and stopped. The cabin wasn't empty, not abandoned, not ransacked, not stripped or rotted or collapsed into the disorder of a forgotten place. It was intact, whole. It looked exactly like a morning in October 1952 when someone walked out of it intending to come back. A wooden table in the center of the room, 2 plates on it, both empty, both exactly placed. A tin cup near the edge. A coat on a hook by the door, a heavy man's coat, the kind people called a mackinaw, so old the red plaid had faded to rust and gray. A bookshelf against the far wall. A wood stove with old ash still banked in it. A calendar on the wall, the page open to October 1952. Nothing overturned, nothing broken, nothing left in the disorder of a hasty departure. It had been left in the careful order of a person who expected, genuinely expected, to return. Nora appeared at her shoulder and looked in. "It looks like a museum," she whispered. "Don't touch anything yet." Clara stepped inside, testing the floor. It creaked but held the boards solid under decades of accumulated grime and dust. She moved slowly, hands clasped behind her back, the way you move through someone else's space when you're not sure of your welcome. The dust was everywhere but thin, a coating rather than a layer, as if even the dust had been measured out, as if the cabin had held itself so still for so long that nothing had settled heavily enough to obscure the details. She stopped at the bookshelf. Farming books, land surveys, a dictionary, a Bible. One book lay slightly apart from the others, differently positioned, its spine facing outward. Not placed, left, a journal. She picked it up the way you pick up something that belongs to someone else, which it did. It had been someone else's for a very long time. The cover was plain leather, worn smooth. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was clear, deliberate, slightly right-leaning, strong. Arthur James Whitfield, September 1952. She breathed through that for a moment. Then she read. The early entries were short, factual. Weather, the state of the fence line, a neighbor's cattle grazing too close. Then in mid-September, the tone changed. Meeting with Hargrove went worse than expected. He has lawyers now, 3 of them. They do not understand the documents, or they understand them too well. She turned pages carefully. The land is worth more than any of us realized when we agreed to this. The surveying last spring, the mineral assessments, Hargrove knows now. He is trying to renegotiate a deal that was never fair to begin with. And then a week later, they do not understand that what they're asking me to sign is not a development agreement. It is a transfer of everything, every acre, every right. And then a line that made her heart knock against her ribs. I have told him no. I will keep telling him no. She turned toward the end. If anything happens, the proof is in the cabin. The deeds are original. The surveys are correct. Do not let them tell you otherwise. The last entry was dated October 14th, 1952. They came back today. H and his men. They were not alone. That was the last line. Full stop. And then blank pages, white and waiting for 72 years. Clara stood in the middle of the cabin holding her grandfather's journal and felt the hair rise on her arms. He had not fled. He had sealed the cabin and left. But whatever had driven him away, he had left the proof behind on purpose, hidden for whenever someone came to find it. She looked at Nora, who was crouched near the fireplace examining the stonework with the focused interest of a child who has decided to understand something. Mom, Nora said without looking up, these stones are different. She pointed to one near the left side of the firebox lower down. This one doesn't match the others. Clara came closer and looked. The stone Nora had found was the same dark granite as the others, but it sat in the mortar with a faint different angle. Newer mortar at its edges, just barely newer, just enough. Clara knelt. She pressed her palm against it. It shifted, just a fraction of an inch. A fraction of an inch that no stone sealed in a wall has any business moving. She pressed harder. It rocked gently, like something waiting on a hinge of patience. She sat back on her heels and felt the pieces of this place arrange themselves in her mind into a shape that hadn't been visible from the doorway. The careful disorder that was actually order. The journal left visible. The stone that didn't match. All of it. Not abandoned. Prepared. Arthur Whitfield had not fled his cabin in October 1952. He had left a map. Don't touch it, she told Nora. Not yet. She needed to understand more before she disturbed anything. She needed to know who had come back that October and what it had cost him. She was still crouched by the fireplace when she heard it. A sound outside the cabin. Footsteps on the frozen ground. Slow. Deliberate. Not hiding. Clara was on her feet before she consciously decided to stand. She crossed to the window and found a gap in the boarded planks, a thin strip of view. Through it, she saw a figure crossing the clearing from the tree line. Old. A woman. Moving carefully, but without hesitation, the way old people move when the hesitation is behind them, and they've already made up their mind. Gray hair cut practical and short under a wool hat. Heavy coat. The kind of boots that had been on this terrain before. The woman walked to within 20 feet of the cabin and stopped. She looked at the door, at the removed seal on the ground, at the gap of open doorway. And then she did something Clara hadn't expected. She closed her eyes for a moment, just a moment, like she was saying something inward that needed no sound, and then she opened them and she looked directly at the gap in the boards where Clara was standing. I know you're in there, the woman said. Her voice was rough and dry, the kind of voice that had lived in mountain air for 60-something years. I saw the seal come off. I've been watching this cabin every day for 20 years. Today's the first time I've seen it open. Clara went to the doorway. The woman was maybe 67. Not soft. The kind of old that has done work for its whole life and doesn't apologize for it. Her eyes were dark, and they were going over Clara the way a person looks at someone they've been waiting to recognize. "You're Arthur's granddaughter," the woman said. Not a question. "How did you know that?" "You've got his jawline." A pause. "And you've got the look of someone who just found out their family has secrets. I know what that looks like." She looked past Clara at the inside of the cabin. "How is it in there?" "Intact," Clara said. "Like he just left." The woman nodded once slowly, like this was exactly what she'd expected to hear. "My name is Agnes Kerrigan," the woman said. "Born Agnes Proctor. I've lived at the bottom of this ridge for 43 years. Before that, my family had a place up here too." A pause, the dark eyes were very still. "Until 1952, when we lost it." She let that land. Then she added, "Same year your grandfather lost his." Clara went out to meet her. Agnes Kerrigan did not extend her hand. She didn't need to. She just stood in the cold clearing and looked at Clara with the steadiness of a person who has rehearsed this conversation for a long time. "My grandfather," Clara said. "What do you know about him?" "Enough." Agnes looked at the cabin. "He was a stubborn man. They don't make them like that anymore. People say that like it's a compliment, but for Arthur Whitfield, stubbornness wasn't a virtue. It was just the truth of him. He would not be moved on a thing he believed in, and what he believed in was that land." She nodded at the cabin. "These acres, the ridge, he'd worked them since before the war. He knew what the surveys said. He knew what the mineral rights meant. And when the Hargroves came to him in the summer of 1952 with their lawyers and their paperwork and their smiles, he was the only man in this valley who said no." "What happened to him?" "He sealed the cabin," Agnes said. "He took his family somewhere. He never came back, or he was never allowed to." She said the last part quietly, without accusation because there was no one left to accuse. But the weight of it was there. "Your family," Clara said. "They also—" "We signed." Agnes's voice was flat. "My grandfather, William Proctor, signed what Arthur refused to sign. He didn't understand what he was agreeing to at the time. Neither did most of the other families. That's what the Hargroves counted on." She looked at her own hands for a moment. "My grandfather died thinking he'd done the right thing for the family. Taken the money, settled. What he actually did was deed over everything, and the Hargroves built an empire on it." She met Clara's eyes. "On it and on what Arthur Whitfield never signed." The cold in the clearing was different from the cold in the cabin. This cold was the open-air kind, the kind that came with elevation and moved. Nora appeared in the doorway behind Clara, assessing Agnes with the careful attention of a child who has learned to read strangers quickly. "Who's this?" Nora asked. "Agnes Kerrigan," the woman said, looking at her. "What's your name?" "Nora." "How old are you?" "9." Agnes looked at Nora for a long moment. Something in her face shifted just slightly, the way something shifts in a face when they see a generation they weren't expecting. "You found the cabin in good shape?" Agnes asked her. "The stones by the fireplace are different," Nora said. "One moves." Agnes turned to Clara with something between approval and surprise. "Observant kid." "She is," Clara said. Agnes put her hands in her coat pockets and looked up at the sky through the gap in the trees. "I have not told anyone what I'm going to tell you," she said. "Not in 70 years. Not my children, not the county, not the lawyers who came sniffing around when the Hargroves first went public. I stayed quiet because I was scared. Because my family's name was on documents I didn't fully understand. And because the Hargroves have money, and money tends to win." She looked back at Clara. "But I am 67 years old. And whatever is in that stone in your grandfather's fireplace, and whatever that journal says, and whatever the county records have kept all this time, it matters. It has always mattered. And I'm tired of it only mattering to me." She said all of this the way someone delivers a decision they've already fully made. Not a confession, not an appeal, a statement. Clara looked at this woman who had kept this secret for 7 decades. This woman who lived at the foot of a ridge she couldn't own in sight of a cabin that had been sealed since her childhood, who watched it every day. Who had carried something for so long it had become part of the architecture of her. What's in the fireplace? Clara asked her. Original deeds, Agnes said. Arthur's survey documents, and the incomplete transfer contract, the one the Hargroves needed his signature to finalize and never got. Your grandfather told my grandfather when it was already too late for him to do anything about it. Told him it was there. Said someday somebody would come to use it. She looked at Clara again with that steady, dark look. He told my grandfather the deeds were left for his heir, the one who'd know what to do with them. A pause. He was specific about that. He said the right one will come, and she'll know what to do. Clara stood in the cold at the edge of her grandfather's sealed clearing and felt 70 years of waiting land on her shoulders like something physical. She. He had said she. 12 years ago, he had updated his will. And once upon a time, a very long time ago, he had told a neighbor the right one will come. She thought about Nora, about the shelter mattress, about $41 and a borrowed wrench and a bus that smelled like diesel. About a morning a year ago when a landlord changed a lock and she had stood on a sidewalk with her daughter's hand in hers and thought, what now? What on earth now? This. This is now. Come inside, Clara said to Agnes Kerrigan. Tell me everything. Agnes looked at the open door for a moment, the 72-year-old air still seeping out of it, the place she had watched for decades from the tree line. All right, she said, and she stepped forward into the cabin that had been waiting for someone to open it. Behind them, the door didn't swing shut. It stayed open, just wide enough to let the first new light of an October afternoon fall across the dusty floor. Across the two plates still set on the table, the rust-red coat on the hook. The calendar stopped in 1952, and in the gap between the stones, the thing Arthur Whitfield had hidden. Waiting, patient as the mountain above it, patient as the pine trees that had kept their distance from this clearing for over 70 years, as if they'd agreed to leave room, as if they'd known somehow that the space would eventually be needed. Agnes Kerrigan sat down at the old table like she'd been waiting all her life to sit at it, which in a sense she had. She kept her coat on. The cabin was cold, the kind of cold that had been sealed into the walls for over 7 decades and didn't warm up for visitors. Clara found a rusted lantern and made it work. The light it threw was orange and uneven and made the whole room look like the inside of a memory. Nora took a position near the bookshelf back against the wall watching Agnes. Not unfriendly, just careful. Like a child who has learned that new adults come in varieties and it's worth knowing which kind before you decide how to behave around them. Agnes looked at the fireplace, at the stone Nora had found. You want to open it now? The old woman said. Yes, Clara said. Then let me do it. Agnes stood across the room and knelt with a grunt at the firebox. Her hands found the stone the way hands find things in the dark, from memory, from years of thinking about exactly where something is. She pressed on the right side, lifted slightly, and the stone came forward cleanly swinging out on a hidden pivot that Arthur Whitfield had engineered sometime before October 1952, with the patience of a man who planned for the long game. Behind it was a space, maybe 12 inches deep, lined with oilcloth. Inside the oilcloth, wrapped in another layer of it, a bundle roughly the size of a large book, tied with a strip of canvas that had gone stiff with age but held. Agnes did not take it out. She sat back and looked at Clara. It's yours, she said. Clara reached in. The bundle was heavier than she expected. She brought it to the table, untied the canvas strip, and peeled the oilcloth back layer by layer with the careful attention of someone who understands that they are handling 70 years of protection. Inside, papers, old paper, the heavy cream-colored kind, with the specific smell of documents that have outlasted the civilization that produced them. Handwritten, typed on an old machine, stamped and signed and dated. Land deeds, original land survey documents, property descriptions in the archaic language of 1940s county records, meets and bounds compass bearings, creek markers, ridge lines, pages of them, hundreds of acres worth, every one bearing Arthur Whitfield's name as sole owner, every one legitimate, every one predating 1952 by years. And beneath them the thing that made Agnes exhale slowly through her nose when Clara held it up. A contract, typed on headed paper with the name Hargrove Land Development Company across the top. The transfer of development rights from Arthur Whitfield to said company. All the right signatures on the company's side. 2 witnesses, a notary seal. Arthur's signature line, blank, just blank. He never signed it, Clara said. He never signed it, Agnes confirmed. The room was quiet except for the sound of Clara's own breathing, which was unsteady in a way she was trying to contain. Because she understood standing there in the orange lantern light in a cabin sealed for over 70 years what this document meant. The Hargroves had built Ridgecrest holdings on land that had never been legally transferred to them. They had developed subdivided, sold, leased, and profited from hundreds of mountain acres for 7 decades on the basis of a contract that had never been finalized, which meant the land still belonged to the person who held the original deeds, which was Arthur Whitfield, deceased, which was his sole heir. Her. Clara set the contract down flat, very flat, like it was a live thing. The company, she said. What do they know? They know the seal was broken, Agnes said. They have people in town. They have people who watch. The county seal comes off that door, word reaches Ridgecrest within hours. A pause. I would assume someone is already on their way up this ridge. Hours. Hours was not very long. Hours was not the kind of timeline you could make a plan inside. Wait, she needed a lawyer. What did she need? She needed to get these documents copies. She needed a phone signal. She needed to think, and she could not think because her hands had started shaking again, and this time she was not going to be able to make them stop by deciding to. Mom, Nora's voice from the bookshelf, steady as always, 9 years old and steady as a plumb line. What do we do first? Clara made herself stop. She made herself look at her daughter. She thought about what a person who had not just lost a year of her life and was not currently standing in a mountain cabin with 7 decades of family secrets in her hands would do right now. She photographed every page with her phone, slowly, methodically making sure each document was fully in frame, well lit by the lantern. Every deed, every survey, the contract with the blank signature line, the notary stamps, the dates, 47 pages total. Then she wrapped them back in the oilcloth, retied the canvas, and was trying to decide whether to put them back in the stone cavity or keep them with her when the sound came from outside. A car, or an SUV more precisely, the kind with a heavy engine that handles mountain roads, coming up the trail at a speed that suggested experience with this terrain. Not a lost tourist, not a ranger. People who drove like that on a trail like this had been on it before. Clara looked at Agnes. Agnes looked back with the expression of a woman who had expected this and was not surprised. Put the documents in the oilcloth, Agnes said quietly. Keep them in your bag. Don't take the bag off your shoulder. Clara did. The oilcloth bundle went into the backpack. The backpack went on. She cinched the straps. The car stopped somewhere out of sight. Doors opened. Then footsteps on the frozen ground measured and unhurried the footsteps of men who are not in a hurry because they believe they hold the advantage. 2 of them appeared in the doorway. The one in front was perhaps 45, well-dressed for mountain terrain, clean boots not worn, a folder under one arm, the kind of face that had spent years being carefully neutral in rooms where decisions were being made. Miss Whitfield, he said. Not a guess. A greeting he had prepared. How did he know her name? Of course he knew her name. The lawyer's office. The county records request. They had resources she had not started to map. I'm Lester Fain, the man said. I represent Ridgecrest Holdings. We were informed that the property here had been reopened. Informed, there was a word doing a lot of work. This is my property, Clara said. Her voice was even. She made it even. You're standing in it without being invited. I apologize for the intrusion. He didn't sound apologetic. He sounded like a man following a script that he had used several times before and found effective. We have a significant interest in the land surrounding this structure. As I understand it, you've just arrived and haven't had the opportunity to assess the state of the building. We have some concerns about structural safety. It's sound, Clara said. I've walked the whole floor. And about the history of the property documentation. Fain continued as if she hadn't spoken. He looked around the cabin without moving his feet, taking a careful inventory. His eyes went to the table, the lantern, the bookshelf, the fireplace, then the papers, her backpack. She saw it happen, the slight sharpening, the recognition. There are documents in this cabin that may be relevant to active county records, Fain said. For the protection of all parties, it may be appropriate for those materials to be secured by the county assessor's office, while ownership questions are, no, Clara said. A pause. Pardon. No, she said again. These documents belong to this property, which belongs to me. If you have business, send it through a lawyer. My lawyer. She did not have a lawyer. That was a problem for later. Right now, she needed a sentence that closed this particular door. The property is legally transferred per the will of Arthur Whitfield. I have the authorization documentation, and I'd like you to leave. Fane studied her. He had the patient stillness of a man who has been told no before and knows several ways around it. Of course, he said. We'll be in touch through proper channels. He didn't move immediately. He did the thing that professional men do when they want to establish that leaving is their choice and not yours. He made a small, composed note in the folder. He looked at Agnes, who was still seated at the table, looking back at him with the specific expression of a woman who has outlasted people like him before and expects to again. Then he left. His companion, who had not spoken once, followed. The footsteps retreated. The car started. It did not drive down immediately. It sat for a moment. Then it moved. Clara stood at the window and watched through the gap in the boards until the sound was completely gone. Then she turned around and found Nora watching her with those 9-year-old eyes, and Agnes still at the table, hands folded. They took pictures, Agnes said. While he was talking, the other one. She tapped the side of her own coat where a phone would go. Documenting what you had with you, what was on the table. She looked at Clara. They'll be back with a county contact and a credible reason to require those documents for a records review. Within a day, maybe 2. Can they do that? With the right county contact, yes. A pause. Ridgecrest has the right county contacts. Clara sat down at the table. She made herself sit because standing was using energy she needed to think. Think. Think, think, think. She had photographs on her phone. She had 47 photographs. She could email them, except she had no signal. She could drive to town, and she didn't have a car. She could get Agnes to drive her, and this was all taking time she wasn't sure she had. What about the documents themselves, she said. If they're removed from here, they'll be lost, Agnes said. Flat. Or they'll be declared too deteriorated to be admissible. Or a clerical error will make them unlocatable. These things happen. These things happen, Clara repeated. To people who inconvenience Ridgecrest Holdings, yes. Okay. So, the originals were at risk. The photographs were on a phone with no signal and no backup. She needed to get the photographs transmitted to someone, preferably a lawyer, before Fane came back with a county reason to require the documents. She looked at Agnes. How far is town, Joan? 12 miles. Do you have a car? A truck at the bottom of the trail. I need to get to a lawyer and email these photographs. Today, in the next, she checked the time on her phone. Nearly 4. In the next 3 hours before any office closes. Agnes stood with the specific decisiveness of someone who has finally, after a very long time, found a task equal to the weight of the thing they've been carrying. Then we go now, she said. Wait. Nora was still at the bookshelf. She was looking at the floor. She was looking at the floor near the back corner behind the bookshelf where the light from the lantern barely reached. Mom, come look at this. Clara's body said go. She told it to wait 30 seconds. She crossed to the bookshelf. Nora crouched and pointed at the floor. The boards. In the far corner where the light was worst and the grime was thickest, 2 of the floorboards had a seam that didn't match the others. Not the natural variation of old wood. A seam with a slight gap that ran in a rectangle roughly 14 by 8 inches. A panel, cut into the floor, fitted so precisely into the surrounding boards that it was nearly invisible unless you were 9 years old and low to the ground and had already found one hidden thing today and were therefore looking for more. Agnes came behind Clara. She looked at the floor, and something moved across her face. Not surprise. The other thing. The thing that comes when a confirmation arrives that you'd hoped for but couldn't count on. Did you know about this? Clara asked. I knew Arthur was not the kind of man to put all his cards in one stone, Agnes said. But I didn't know where. Clara moved the bookshelf. It was light. It hadn't been loaded heavily and the years had dried it out. She knelt at the panel. There was no handle, just the gap. She worked her fingernails into it, then her fingers, and it came up with a soft resistance, the seal of old wood and pressure, and beneath it was a second cavity deeper than the first, lined with the same oilcloth. Two things inside, a second bundle of papers, the same oilcloth, the same canvas, roughly the same size as the first, and an envelope. White paper not as old as the deeds, but old enough. Her name on it. Not Clara Whitfield, just Clara. In handwriting she had never seen and immediately recognized. Arthur. She held the envelope for a moment without opening it. Nora was very still beside her. Agnes had moved back to give her space that she didn't ask for, but understood she needed. Take both, Agnes said quietly. We'll look at them somewhere with a locked door. They wrapped everything, packed everything. Clara put the second bundle and the envelope in the deepest part of the backpack below the oilcloth from the fireplace. She replaced the floor panel. She replaced the bookshelf. She looked around the cabin one more time. The coat on the hook, the calendar, the two plates. Lock the door behind us, Agnes said. You won't be able to seal it again, but lock it. Clara locked it. She had a padlock in her pack brought for no particular reason, except that she'd had one, and it was the kind of thing you carry when you've learned that you can't rely on other people's locks. She threaded it through the old iron handle in the frame and snapped it shut. Not the same as a government seal, but something. They went down the trail in the last of the afternoon light, Nora between them, nobody speaking. The mountain held its sounds around them, and the trees moved in the cold wind coming down from the peaks. And Clara walked with her hand on the backpack strap and thought about a man she'd never known who had written her name on an envelope. Agnes's truck was where she'd left it. Old Chevy, the kind of old that is held together by stubbornness and institutional memory. It started without complaint. They drove 12 miles without speaking much. Agnes drove the way she moved with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned a long time ago not to waste motion. The town was small, mountain small. One main street, a hardware store, a diner, a real estate office, with a Ridgecrest Holdings sign in the window. Clara stared at that sign as they drove past. Agnes looked straight ahead. The county records office was 3 blocks from the main street. It closed at 5. They arrived at 4:22. The clerk was a woman in her 50s who looked up with the expression of someone deciding whether to be helpful or not. Clara put the legal folder on the counter, the notarized authorization from Grantham and Associates, and said, I need to search the original land records for Arthur James Whitfield Coldwater Ridge parcel, recorded before 1952. The clerk looked at the folder, at Clara, at Agnes behind her. That's a long time ago, the clerk said. Yes, Clara said. A pause, the clerk typed. Typed more, stopped typing, typed again. The silence in the records office had the particular quality of a room where something is either found or not found, and the difference between those two outcomes is large. There's no finalized transfer on file for those parcels, the clerk said finally. She sounded like she wasn't entirely sure she was saying this correctly. The original ownership records list Arthur James Whitfield as the primary deed holder. There's an incomplete transfer document referenced more typing. But the transfer file is flagged as unsigned. There's no recorded completion. Clara's hands were on the counter. She looked at them. So the land still belongs to the original deed holder, she said. Or his heir. Legally. The clerk picked her words the way you pick footing on unstable ground. That's a matter for an attorney to determine. I can only tell you what the records reflect. You should speak to a lawyer immediately. Thank you, Clara said. She got the clerk to print the relevant pages. She signed a request form. She photographed the computer screen, showing the search results with the timestamp visible. She did every redundant thing she could think of to document what the clerk had just told her, because she had learned this year that the things you don't document have a way of becoming things that never happened. Then she went to the diner across the street. She asked to use their Wi-Fi. She sat at the counter with a cup of coffee she paid for with 4 of her remaining dollars, and she emailed every photograph, the deeds, the surveys, the unsigned contract, the county records, screen grabbed to every email address she could remember that might belong to someone who could receive it. Her father's old lawyer in Denver, a friend from college who had gone to law school and now handled divorces but was a lawyer nonetheless. The Grantham and Associates address from the inheritance letter. Then she sat and drank the rest of her coffee and thought about the envelope in her backpack with her name on it. Agnes came to sit beside her. Nora was in a booth behind them eating a grilled cheese that Agnes had quietly paid for, and the sound of Nora eating was the most normal sound in the world. "What was in the second bundle?" Clara said. "I haven't looked," Agnes said. "It's yours." "But you knew it was there." "I knew Arthur would have a backup." Agnes turned her coffee cup in her hands. "He was a methodical man. He didn't do things once when he could do them twice." She looked straight ahead. "The envelope. He wrote your name." "Yes." "He knew about you." "He must have. He updated the trust 12 years ago. The lawyer confirmed it." A pause. "I don't know how he kept track of my life. He never contacted us." "He may have had reasons for the distance that weren't indifference," Agnes said. Clara looked at her. "What kind of reasons?" Agnes was quiet for a moment. "The Hargroves have long memories," she said, "and Arthur knew that if they connected him to living heirs, it would put those heirs in a position he didn't want them in. So he stayed away. So he sealed the cabin. So he put it in a trust instead of a direct inheritance." She looked at Clara. "Not abandonment, protection. There's a difference. It's a painful difference, but it's a difference." Clara looked at her coffee. "Not abandonment, protection." She had grown up in a family where her grandfather was simply absent, simply gone, simply a man who disappeared from the story without explanation. She had inherited that absence as a fact. A closed door, a face in a photograph, a silence that nobody thought to explain because the explanations had been misplaced along the way. And now she was sitting in a diner in the town her grandfather had been pushed out of with documents in her backpack that might change the shape of the last 70 years, in an envelope with her name on it in a dead man's handwriting. She went back to the booth with Nora. Agnes stayed at the counter. She took the envelope out. The paper was good quality, folded carefully around the outside of the letter. It had been stored in the dry oilcloth, and it had survived. The flap was sealed with wax. Old wax, dark red with no impression. Just sealed. By hand. She broke it carefully. Unfolded the paper inside. The handwriting was the same as the journal. Strong. Right-leaning. Clear. It began, Clara. Not dear Clara. Not to my granddaughter. Just her name. Direct like the beginning of a conversation that has been postponed too long. She read, "By the time you read this, a lot of time has passed. I don't know how much. I left instructions with a lawyer in Telluride to hold this trust until there was a direct heir who needed it. He was told to watch the family line and to look for the right circumstance. I know that sounds strange. I know it may feel like I was watching from a distance and choosing not to speak. The truth is more complicated and less forgivable than I would like. I kept my distance because keeping distance was the only way I could protect the people I cared about from the Hargroves and what they would do to anyone who stood between them and those acres. I know what they cost. I know what it cost my neighbors. I watched it happen, and I could not stop it, and I have carried that weight for the rest of my life. What I could do was hold the deeds, hold them and seal them and leave them for whoever came to claim them with enough proof to do something real. I chose you, Clara, not because you are the oldest or the first or the most obvious choice. I chose you because of what the lawyer's people reported to me about your life. That you keep going when most people would have stopped. That you hold things together with your hands when the glue runs out. That you have done this more than once. I don't know what you've been through by the time you read this, but I think I know what kind of woman you are. You are the same kind of woman your grandmother was, which is to say you don't quit. Even when quitting would be the sensible thing. Even when the world gives you very good reasons to. Use what I've left you wisely, not for revenge, not for settlement, for something that lasts. The land is a tool. It is only worth what you build on it. I am sorry I could not tell you this in person. I am sorry for the years of silence. I did not forget you. I thought about you a great deal. With love, Arthur." Clara sat in the booth in the diner in the mountain town her grandfather had been forced out of and read the letter 3 times. Once fast, once slow, once with her finger tracing each line as if she could find more inside the words than the words themselves contained. Nora sat across from her and did not ask any questions, which was the most loving thing she could have done. Eventually, Clara folded the letter back into the envelope. She held it with both hands the way you hold something you are not ready to put down. You are the same kind of woman your grandmother was. She had never known her grandmother who had died before Clara was born, but she knew what not quitting looked like. She had been demonstrating it for about 12 months without knowing she was demonstrating anything except survival. Agnes was right that protection and abandonment feel the same from the outside. She wasn't going to resolve that tonight. Some things take longer than one evening in a mountain diner to fully absorb. But she held the letter, and she held her daughter's voice asking if the grilled cheese could have more pickles, and she let those two things exist at the same time. Then she put the envelope in the very deepest part of the backpack below everything else. Safe. Her phone had signal in the diner. The emails had sent. She had confirmations. The photographs were transmitted. The county records were documented. The originals were in her backpack. And outside somewhere, Lester Fane was making phone calls. She looked at Agnes at the counter. Agnes looked back, waiting with the patience of a woman who had waited much longer for much smaller things. "They're going to come back to the cabin," Clara said, "with a county representative this time." "Yes. And if they get the originals—" "They won't be the originals anymore," Agnes said. "Legally speaking, you'll have the photographs and the county records confirmation. That's not nothing, but it's harder. Then we need to be back at the cabin before they are." Clara paused. "And I need a lawyer." "Telluride," Agnes said. "Grantham and Associates. The one who sent the inheritance letter. He's been sitting on this case for 30 years. He will want to see those documents." How fast can we get there, Agnes thought. 2 hours on the mountain roads. If we leave now, we arrive before 9. The office won't be open, but he gave you a contact number. Lawyers who handle this kind of case give out contact numbers. They want the call when it comes. Clara stood. She shouldered the backpack. She looked at Nora. "Can you eat the rest of the grilled cheese in the truck?" Nora was already wrapping it in a napkin. "Yes," she said. Like this was the obvious answer. Like this was no different from the other 50 times in the last year when eating on the move was the only way eating happened. And Clara looked at this child of hers, this 9-year-old with the careful eyes and the economy of motion and the specific gravity of someone who has already learned that the world is not stable, but you get up anyway. This kid who had never once in 12 months of a year that should have broken both of them stopped being steady. She thought about a man writing a letter, "You are the same kind of woman your grandmother was." She thought, and Nora is the same kind of girl I was. And she is going to be fine. Because what runs in this family is not bad luck. It is the refusal to accept bad luck as the final condition. "Let's go," she said. They went. Outside, the mountain night was coming down hard and cold. The stars already clear at altitude, the kind of clear you only get above the cloud layer. Agnes's truck headlights cut the dark road north toward Telluride. Nora fell asleep against the passenger window inside of 20 minutes grilled cheese sandwich, still half in hand. And Clara held the backpack in her lap, both arms around it, and looked out at the dark mountain shapes against the slightly lighter dark of the sky. Behind them, 12 miles away, in a locked cabin in a clearing that the forest had kept to itself for over 70 years, 2 empty plates still sat on a table. A coat still hung on a hook. A calendar still showed October 1952. And the stone by the fireplace sat back in its place, fitted perfectly, holding nothing now but the space where the proof had been. The proof was moving at 60 miles an hour through the mountains in the arms of the woman whose grandfather had been waiting with the patience of pine trees for her to come and get it. The next day was going to be hard. Clara knew that. Lester Fane was going to come back with a county official and a reason that sounded airtight. Ridgecrest Holdings had lawyers' resources and 70 years of practice protecting what they believed was theirs. But they had never gone up against what was actually theirs. And they had never gone up against a woman who had already lost everything she built once and had decided, standing in a cleared space where a man she'd never met had laid the groundwork for exactly this moment, that she was not going to lose it twice. The truck climbed into the mountains. The stars didn't move. And Clara Whitfield, with her dead grandfather's letter against her chest and her daughter asleep against the window, and an old woman's hand steady on the wheel, rode toward the morning that was going to change everything. She was not afraid. That surprised her, actually. She had expected to be afraid, but the thing she felt instead was older and more specific. The feeling of a door opening after a very long time. The particular feeling of a woman who has been running on borrowed time for so long she'd forgotten she was allowed to own any. For the first time in a year, the thing in front of her was bigger than the thing behind her, which was the only direction worth moving. The lawyer's name was Philip Grantham, and he answered his phone at 10 past 9 on a Wednesday night, which told Clara everything she needed to know about the kind of lawyer he was. "Miss Whitfield," he said before she could identify herself, "I've been waiting for this call for a while." His office was in a Victorian building 2 blocks from the Telluride Main Street, and they were sitting in it by 10:30 with the heat on and coffee appearing from somewhere Clara didn't track. Grantham was 70, maybe older, with the specific sharpness of a very old knife. He had taken the trust documents from Arthur Whitfield's estate into his keeping 31 years ago. He had updated them as instructed. He had watched the file and waited as his client had requested for the right combination of circumstances and air. He spread the documents across his conference table and looked at them the way a man looks at something he's been protecting for a long time. "The deeds are original," he said. "They'll authenticate." He was already looking at the unsigned contract. "And this," he held it up. "This is what I told Arthur would matter if it survived." "Is it enough?" Clara said. Grantham turned the contract over, set it down, picked up the county records confirmation from Clara's phone, which she'd screenshot and printed at the diner. "Ridgecrest Holdings has been developing these parcels for decades," he said, "on the basis of a transfer they never completed. The county records simply never caught the gap. It's not unusual. Rural records in the 1950s were not always rigorously maintained." He looked at Clara. "They may argue adverse possession. They may argue estoppel. They will argue something." A pause. "But these documents are what I told your grandfather would give you the position to negotiate from. Not a guaranteed win, a position." "What kind of position?" "A position where the alternative of full public challenge of their foundational land claims is expensive enough and damaging enough to their current projects that they come to the table." He looked at the documents again. "Ridgecrest has municipal contracts in this county, housing developments, a resort expansion that went to permitting last year. A full challenge, even if they ultimately won, would freeze all of that for years. The investor exposure alone." He set the papers down. "They'll come to the table." "When?" "Tomorrow," Grantham said, "if you're ready." Clara looked at Agnes, who was sitting with her coffee not involved because she had made it clear when they arrived that she was here to witness and when the time came to speak. Not to plan. Planning was not her role anymore. She had been planning in her own head for decades. Now it was time for someone else to use the plan. Then she looked at Nora. Nora was asleep in the leather chair in the corner. Asleep like she had decided that the right move was to bank rest while adults sorted the complicated parts, which was actually a fairly intelligent decision. "Yes," Clara said. "I'm ready." Ridgecrest Holdings occupied the 4th floor of the only modern building in downtown Telluride, glass and steel above historic stone, which told you something about their relationship with the landscape they'd built on. The meeting was at 10. Grantham had requested it the previous night through formal channels and received a response by 7 a.m., which confirmed what he'd said they were watching. They'd known the seal came off. They had known since the moment it happened. They were ready. So was she. The elevator opened into a conference room with a view of the mountain that Agnes's family had once owned. A long table, dark wood, 8 chairs on one side filled with men in suits of varying seriousness. 2 chairs empty at the head, which was where you put people you wanted to feel outnumbered. Clara sat down. Nora sat beside her. Agnes sat on Clara's other side and put her hands flat on the table and looked at the men like a woman who has waited 70 years for this seating arrangement and finds it adequate. Grantham placed his briefcase on the table and opened it without drama. The man at the center of the Ridgecrest side was not Lester Fane. Fane was their end of the row expression, professional and unrevealing. The man at the center was older, 60-something, with a nameplate that said Richard Hargrove III. The third. His grandfather had made the deal. His father had built on it. He had inherited the inheritance. He looked at Clara with the careful expression of a man calculating something. "Miss Whitfield," he said, "we appreciate your willingness to meet." "You appreciate my having documentation," Clara said. "That's what this is." Hargrove absorbed this without visible reaction. "We're aware of the ownership questions raised by the documents you've located. We'd like to explain our position regarding the historical development of these parcels." "Your position," Grantham said, "is that you have been developing land for 72 years on the basis of an unsigned transfer contract. We have the original deeds. We have the county records confirming no finalized transfer. And we have documentation that your company has been aware of this gap for at least the duration of your current municipal permitting process. That last part, Clara watched it land, watched the very slight rearrangement of faces, the permitting process. Grantham had done homework last night that Clara hadn't tracked and didn't need to. There are legal doctrines that may apply, Hargrove said. Adverse possession, the development rights argument, all of which take years to litigate, Grantham said. At which point your resort expansion is frozen. Your housing project is frozen. Your county contracts are under review. Investor calls begin within approximately 48 hours of a public filing. Silence. This was the moment. Clara could feel it in the room. The moment where the math becomes undeniable. And then Agnes Kerrigan cleared her throat. It was not a loud sound. It was the sound a person makes when they've decided to speak after a very long time of not speaking, and the decision has weight. Every head in the room turned to look at the 67-year-old woman with the wool hat and the mountain boots and the hands flat on the conference table. My name is Agnes Kerrigan, she said. My maiden name was Proctor. My grandfather was William Proctor. He signed what Arthur Whitfield refused to sign in 1952. She looked at Richard Hargrove III with the particular steadiness of someone who no longer has anything to lose. I have lived at the foot of Coldwater Ridge for 43 years. On land, my family signed away to your grandfather's company for a price that seemed fair and turned out to be the last sale we ever made. I know the Hargrove family's history in this valley the way you know your own name. Because I watched it from below. I watched it from the property line. And I am telling you in this room with a lawyer present that I am prepared to give a full account of what I witnessed and heard in the summer and fall of 1952, including conversations your grandfather had with mine that your family has counted on me being too afraid to repeat. She paused. I am not afraid anymore. I have been afraid for 70 years. I am 67 years old and I have run out of reasons to keep being afraid. The conference room was entirely still. Hargrove looked at Agnes, at Clara, back at Agnes. He looked at a woman who was not reading from notes, who was not performing, who was simply sitting at a table in a mountain town that used to belong to her family and telling the truth in a voice as steady as old timber. He had not expected her. That was visible. For just a moment behind the careful neutrality, he had not expected her. Lester Fane at the far end was writing something. We would welcome any clarifying testimony, one of the other lawyers began, in an appropriate evidentiary proceeding. Or, Clara said, quiet. One word. She opened the backpack. She took out the oilcloth. She unwrapped it on the conference table carefully until the deeds and the unsigned contract lay open in front of her. Then she reached into the deepest part of the bag, and she took out the envelope. She held it for a moment. Arthur's handwriting on the outside. Just her name, Clara. My grandfather wrote me a letter, she said. He wrote it knowing he might never get to deliver it in person. He wrote it for whoever I would be when I finally found it. She looked at Hargrove. I'm going to read it. Not because it's a legal document, it isn't, but because the man who spent 72 years holding these deeds and protecting this cabin so that I could sit in this room deserves to have his words in this room too. She unfolded the letter. She read it aloud. All of it. From Clara to I did not forget you. She read it in a voice that didn't shake. The voice she used when Nora needed to hear her be certain. The voice that had said it will be okay at least 300 times in the past year, and had not always believed it, but had said it anyway because saying it was the only version of it being true that she could control. The conference room was very quiet when she finished. Not the strategic quiet of men calculating their next position. Something else. The quiet that happens when something true is said inside a room that has held a lot of careful untruths for a long time, and the truth changes the air. Nora beside her hadn't moved. She was looking at the letter in Clara's hands with the expression of a child who has just understood something large. Hargrove was looking at his own hands on the table. One of his lawyers leaned in and said something near his ear. He listened, didn't respond. Another lawyer on the right said something else. Hargrove held up one finger. Not at Clara, at his own people. One finger, meaning wait. He looked up. He looked at Clara. Not at Grantham. Not at Agnes. At Clara. "What do you want?" he asked. Not angrily, not strategically, like a man who has decided to start the real conversation. Clara had thought about this. Not last night, she hadn't had time last night. She'd thought about it on the way up in the truck before Nora fell asleep, working through it the way she worked through everything now methodically, because methodology was what she had when inspiration ran out. Recognition, she said. Legal recognition of the original ownership. My name on the deeds properly filed in the county record. Not a buyout. Ownership. She let that sit. A percentage of the revenue from every development project on the Whitfield parcels paid into a trust in my daughter's name. Going forward. Not retroactive. A pause. And the cabin is designated a historical site, under my care, with a public record acknowledging what it is and how it came to be sealed. Hargrove was quiet. The alternative, Grantham added, is a full public filing challenging the foundational ownership claims on all Whitfield-adjacent parcels, which we can have prepared by end of week. I know what the alternative is, Hargrove said. Not aggressive. Tired, like a man who has been holding something heavy for longer than he realized and is now being offered a reason to set it down. Give us until end of day. They gave him until end of day. They were in a diner across the street by 11:30. Same diner, different table, because sometimes the world circles back on itself in small ways. Agnes ordered soup. Nora ordered eggs, which was what she always ordered when given a choice because eggs were reliable. Clara drank coffee and looked at the mountain outside the window. You did well, Agnes said. We'll see. No. Agnes set down her spoon. You did well. In that room. With the letter. That mattered. She looked at Clara. Your grandfather would have been glad. Clara thought about a man she had never known, who had watched from a distance, who had decided from whatever information he could gather that she was the right one, who had sealed a door and left her the key inside a stone in a fireplace and trusted that she would find it. She thought about what it meant to be chosen by someone who chose carefully, who did not give away their trust easily, who had made her wait until she was ready to use it. Why didn't you ever speak? Clara asked Agnes. In 70 years. Why wait for me? Agnes was quiet for a while. She stirred her soup. Because I was afraid, she said. And then I wasn't afraid, but I told myself it was too late. And then I wasn't afraid, and it wasn't too late, but I was alone. There was no one to stand beside. She looked at Clara. You can't stand up alone against something that big. You can know the truth alone. You can carry it alone. But to say it out loud in a room like that, she shook her head. You need someone to stand with you. I didn't have that. Until yesterday. She looked at Nora. Until you two came down that mountain. Nora was eating her eggs with the focused attention she brought to most things. She looked up when she felt Agnes looking at her. I found the stone, Nora said. You did, Agnes confirmed. That was important. Nora considered this. I find things, she said. I'm good at it. I know, Agnes said. You're going to be very good at a lot of things. Nora went back to her eggs satisfied, and Clara looked at this old woman and felt something she hadn't expected. Gratitude, yes, but also something more mutual than gratitude. The recognition that in this situation both of them had needed the other. That Agnes without Clara had 70 years of silence, and Clara without Agnes had a stone she couldn't pry open alone. That the cabin itself had needed both of them to enter it. Some things don't open for one person. Grantham called at 3:47. They've agreed, he said, to the principal terms. Legal recognition of the Whitfield deeds as the foundational ownership record. Revenue share, they've counter-proposed 4% of gross on all Whitfield-adjacent parcels. I'm recommending you accept with a minimum guaranteed quarterly, regardless of project revenue. The historical designation is agreed they'll underwrite the first phase of preservation, and that will go into the agreement as a binding obligation. And they want a confidentiality clause on the details of today's meeting. A pause. What do you think? Clara asked. I think 4% is lower than I'd like, but the guaranteed minimum makes it workable. I think the historical designation is the part that can't be undone and is ultimately what matters most. And I think the confidentiality clause protects them from public embarrassment without affecting your rights. I think you should take it. Clara looked out the diner window at the mountain. What does the guaranteed minimum work out to? She asked. He told her. She held that number in her mind. She held it next to $41 and a plastic shelter mattress and a landlord's lock and a year of keeping her face steady for a 9-year-old. "I'll take it," she said. The signing happened the next morning. A different room, smaller, with only the essential people. Clara Grantham, 2 Ridgecrest lawyers, no Hargrove himself. Lester Fane at the end of the table with the particular expression of a man who has just understood something about the situation that was not available to him 48 hours ago. The documents were signed, notarized, filed electronically with the county records office before noon. Clara walked out of the building with Grantham into the October mountain air and looked up at the sky. "That's it," she said. "That's the beginning," he said. "There's a lot of administrative work to follow, but yes, that's the thing itself." He looked at her. "Your grandfather was right about you, you know. I've been doing estate work for 40 years. The people who receive inheritances like this one, most of them take the buyout. They take the money and close the file and go home. It's the rational thing to do. Easy, clean." He paused. "You didn't take the easy thing." "The easy thing never stays easy," Clara said. "In my experience." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. "No," he said. "In my experience as well." Agnes was waiting on the sidewalk. She didn't ask how it went. She could read it in Clara's face. "The cabin stays," Clara said. Agnes looked at the mountain. "Good." Nora was sitting on the steps below them, writing something in the small notebook she carried everywhere. Clara looked down at her. "Nora, we're done." Nora looked up. "Are we going home?" A pause, the kind of pause that had to be processed before answering. "We're going back to the cabin," Clara said. "For now." "Is that home?" Clara thought about that. About a clearing in a pine forest. A cabin that had been waiting with the patience of old-growth timber. The smell of old paper and something her grandfather had loved enough to seal away and protect for the right person. "It might be," she said. "For a while, let's go see." They drove back up that afternoon Agnes's truck on the mountain road, the same road in reverse. The same trees, the same altitude, the same cold air coming through the window. But different. The kind of different that isn't visible and doesn't look like anything from the outside, but changes the weight of everything. The cabin was as they'd left it. Padlock on the door. The government seal still on the ground where Clara had left it. The clearing holding its perimeter of trees. Clara unlocked the door. It opened the same way it had the first time. The same groan of old wood and iron, the same cold air. But this time the stale air didn't feel like the exhalation of loss. It felt like the beginning of ventilation. Like a room finally being allowed to breathe. She walked in, Nora behind her. Agnes last, who stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the calendar and the coat on its hook before she stepped inside. "The first time I've been in here," Agnes said quietly. "First time for all of us," Clara said. "Arthur used to meet my grandfather at the property line," Agnes said. "They'd talk for an hour and then go back to their own land. I don't think my grandfather ever came inside." She looked at the coat. "That looks like his coat, the one he always wore." "It's still hanging there," Clara said. "He thought he was coming back," Agnes said. "He always thought he was coming back." They stood in the cabin and let that be true for a moment without trying to do anything with it. Nora went to the bookshelf. She ran a finger along the spines of the books without touching them. She found the journal that Clara had opened on the first day and looked at it. "Can I read it?" she asked. "When we have time to read it together," Clara said. "Yes." She walked to the fireplace. She knelt and pressed the stone back into its proper position. The cavity behind it was empty now. The documents were in Grantham's safe. The letter was in her backpack. The proof was no longer hidden because it no longer needed to be. It was filed. Official. On record. Under her name in the county system. A fact instead of a secret. She pressed the stone until it sat flush. Then she sat on the floor of her grandfather's cabin and looked at the room. The October light coming through the gaps in the boards, which would be the first thing to address. The windows would need to be unboarded and reglazed. The roof would need a full assessment. The wood stove would need cleaning and testing. The floor needed work in spots. The whole thing needed a year of careful attention. She had a year. She had more than that. Agnes sat in one of the 2 chairs at the table. She put her elbows on the surface and her chin in her hands and looked at the calendar on the wall. October 1952, the same month. 72 years, she said. That calendar hasn't changed in 72 years. Do you want to change it? Clara asked. Agnes was quiet for a while. Not yet, she said. Let it stay for a bit longer. I need to look at it a little more. Nora found a broom in the corner that had somehow survived 7 decades and was attempting to sweep the floor. The broom mostly moved dust from one location to another, which was an honest description of most beginnings. But she swept with the systematic attention she brought to things she decided to take seriously, and after 20 minutes a recognizable path had emerged across the center of the room. Clara watched her. She thought about what Grantham had said. The people who receive inheritances like this one, most of them take the buyout. She thought about standing in the boardroom reading the letter aloud, about Agnes's hands flat on the table, about Richard Hargrove III looking at her with the expression of a man encountering something he hadn't prepared for. She thought about her grandfather's voice in the letter. Not warm exactly, precise, knowing. The voice of a man who had watched from a distance and understood something about her that she was only now understanding about herself. You don't quit, even when quitting would be the sensible thing. She hadn't quit. She'd thought about it many times. She had sat with the idea of giving up the way you sit, with the idea of lying down in cold weather, knowing that lying down is the thing that kills you, and thinking about it anyway because standing is exhausting. But she had stood, every time. Not heroically, practically. Because her daughter was watching, and because the alternative was worse, and because something in the shape of her had never quite been able to arrange itself into the shape of defeat. Turns out that was an inheritance too, just not the kind you find in a lawyer's letter. Agnes stayed for dinner. Nora heated soup on a camp stove Clara had brought, the same one that had been in the backpack since the shelter, because you learn to carry what you might need. They ate at the old table under the old lantern, with the October light outside going to purple and then to dark. Nobody said very much. The cabin said things without language, the creak of its wood and the smell of it, the presence of a coat on a hook and a calendar that would eventually need to be changed, and a journal on a shelf that would take years to fully understand. Agnes left before 8. She shook Clara's hand at the door, which was the first handshake and the last one because everything after this would not require handshakes. She held Nora's hand in both of hers for a moment and told her she was a good finder. Nora said thank you with the seriousness of someone receiving a meaningful credential. Come down for coffee, Agnes said to Clara at the door. When you're ready. When we're settled, Clara said. Which might be a while. I've been waiting a while, Agnes said. I've got more. She walked across the clearing to the tree line and into it, and the dark closed over her, and Clara stood in the doorway of the cabin and watched the place where Agnes had been until there was no sound but the mountain. She and Nora slept that night on the floor of the cabin in sleeping bags from the backpack, the kind designed for cold weather, which was all Clara owned. The wood stove she couldn't use yet, not until it was inspected. But the cabin held the day's heat better than she expected. The old walls were thick. The old wood remembered its function. Nora was asleep in minutes. She slept like she always slept when things had resolved, which was completely without the slight held tension that came when things hadn't. Clara lay on her back and looked at the ceiling. The ceiling her grandfather had put there. The roof he'd patched. The walls he'd built to last. She held her phone. She opened her email. She saw the confirmation from Grantham's office of the filed documents time-stamped and reference numbered. She saw the preliminary preservation assessment that Ridgecrest's own people had sent over because that was now their contractual obligation. She saw an email from the Grantham and Associates office with the trust account details the revenue share terms, the minimum guaranteed quarterly amount. She stared at that number for a while. Then she put the phone down and looked at the ceiling again. She thought about what her grandfather had said. The land is a tool. It is only worth what you build on it. She didn't have the complete answer yet. She had pieces. The cabin restored, preserved, open. Not a museum. A place, a functioning place that someone actually lived in, which was a kind of preservation she thought mattered more than the other kind. Nora, growing up in a place with a history, with the knowledge that her great-great-grandfather had held something for her, that there were people in her family who had been difficult to move. Agnes coming for coffee, walking up the trail that her own grandfather had once walked to talk to Arthur at the property line, walking it as a guest, now not a ghost, having a place to sit that had been waiting for her even if neither of them had known it at the time. These were the pieces. They didn't add up to a plan yet. They added up to a direction, which was enough. She'd been working with enough before. She fell asleep to the sound of the cabin settling around her. Old wood, old joints adjusting to the cold, the way old things do with small sounds that were not alarms, but simply the evidence of something continuing to hold together. In the spring, Grantham's office filed the full historical designation paperwork. The county approved it in May. The approval came with a small dedication ceremony that 3 people attended: Clara, Nora, and Agnes. The county preservation officer drove up and made a brief speech and put a plaque on the outside wall of the cabin that said, Arthur James Whitfield, 1952, and listed the dates and the significance. Clara stood in the clearing looking at the plaque, at her grandfather's name and medal on the building he had built to last in a clearing the pine trees had kept for over 70 years. She thought I didn't know you, and you knew me anyway. Agnes stood beside her with her arms folded against the spring chill, looking at the plaque, with the expression of a woman who has finally seen something put in its right place. Nora ran through the clearing, making use of the space. One of the boarded windows was unboarded now. The glass replaced the light coming in clean and full across the floor. She'd spent a month treating the wood, coming back with work and oil to the color it must have been before the decades. The wood stove worked. She'd had it inspected, and it worked. She'd burned wood in it every night of the Colorado winter, and it threw heat the way a good stove throws heat, even in deep. The 2 plates and the coat and the calendar, she'd kept those. She left where they were. Some things earn the right to remain exactly where they are. The floor panel was still there beneath the bookshelf, empty. She'd thought about removing it. She'd decided against it. It was part of the architecture, part of what the place was. She'd also left the government seal on the ground where she'd set it first day. It would eventually rust entirely. In the meantime, it lay face up in the dirt of the clearing facing the sky. It had kept the cabin for over 70 years, which seemed fair. It was a start. It was exactly a start. The cabin was livable and not much more. The money from the trust was real but not large. There was work ahead, a year's worth, 5 years' worth, the kind of work you don't finish so much as you hand forward. But Claire had come through the worst year of her life to a clearing in the pine trees with a foundation under her feet that no one had any authority to take. Her grandfather had held it for her for 72 years, with the patience of a man who understood that some things take the time they take, and no amount of wanting changes the schedule. He had written, I did not forget you. I thought about you a great deal. She had not known him. She had, in a sense, always known him. The part that didn't quit, the part that built things to last, the part that put the proof in the stone and trusted that the right person would come to find it. She had found it. She had used it the way he'd intended, not for settlement, not for a price, for something that stayed. Mom, Nora from the edge of the clearing. There's a bird's nest in the woodpile. Clara looked. Nora was crouched beside the covered woodpile, pointing at a spot under the canvas. Some small bird, industrious and unasked, had found a corner of warmth and begun a project. Leave it, Clara said. I know, Nora said. I wasn't going to touch it. She stood, looked back at the nest, looked up at the sky. It means things are staying warm enough. Things were staying warm enough. It wasn't a grand conclusion. It wasn't the kind of thing you put on a plaque. But standing in a clearing in the mountains in May with her daughter and an old woman, in a building with her grandfather's name on it, and a bird's nest where last year there had been nothing alive, it seemed like exactly the right amount of conclusion. The pine trees stood where they always had, patient, their own kind of keeping. And the door of the cabin stood open just as she'd left it, letting the May air move through for the first time in over 70 years. Light in, cold out, and something her grandfather had built holding steady around all of it, the way he'd always meant it to.